Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodian of the land we meet today and pay my respect to their elder, past and present. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Then I pay my special respect to all the fallen heroes from Spring Revolution in Myanmar. I would like to thank this man AMI presenter, Vicky Bowman and Kyaw Phyo Phyo Aye. I appreciate all our participants from different parts of the world for joining the AMI seminar today. Our AMI president, Nicholas Koppel, will open the meeting. Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to this very important topic of the state of Myanmar's apparel sector. Tonight we have two speakers, two extremely well-qualified speakers to talk on this topic. Vicky Bowman and Kyaw Phyo Phyo Aye. Vicky Bowman was the Director of the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business for 12 years. She's been a senior advisor, or she is, sorry, a senior advisor at the Institute of Human Rights and Business, chair of the Global Network Initiative, and also on the board of the International Code of Conduct Association. She's previously worked with Rio Tinto as well as with the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as it was called then, and served two times in Myanmar, first as Second Secretary in the Embassy, and then as the British Ambassador to Myanmar from 2002 to 2006. Our other speaker this evening, Kyaw Phyo Phyo Aye, well, I say this evening, sorry, some of you are, it's morning, is a social compliance specialist and founder of ProEthics Solutions, which is a consultancy dedicated to child labour prevention, remediation and young worker protection in Myanmar's garment industry. She, for over 15 years, has experience working with international brands, development programs and civil society organisations in social compliance, human rights and ethical supply chains. She's been selected as a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics under the Charles Wallace Burma Trust Fellowship. And while she's there, she'll be researching child labour in Myanmar's garment sector. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to our speakers. I think, Vicky, you'll be speaking first. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick and Mayor Chair. So I'm going to speak relatively rapidly about some of the facts and figures and current developments in the sector, and then Ma Chue is going to speak more around specific social compliance issues, including child labour. I'm very conscious, looking at the attendance list, there's a huge amount of expertise in these issues on the line listening, so I hope that there'll be some really interesting questions and comments from the audience too. I have various hats, and I'm speaking just on a personal basis, not on behalf of any institution. Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business, we're in the process of closing it down. It's been closed in Myanmar since last year, and we're winding up the UK end, but we are leaving the website up there for another 5 years unless the internet crashes. And so a lot of the work that we did on different sectors, including mining, private security, digital and so on, it's all up there because we don't want to see that work lost. As I say, I'm going to talk about the sector, about specific issues relating to heightened human rights due diligence in the sector, something about both the state of trade unions and labour rights organisations and also the ILO, and then places where you can find other sources of information. So looking first at what the sector looks like and how it's trended over the last 5 years, 6 years, in terms of what was an initial very rapid growth since 2012, which 2019 was still very much on an upward trajectory. Then we had COVID, which led globally to a dip in garment exports, but then there was a rapid rebound in 2022 globally, including in Myanmar. But since then, we've seen a decline over the last 2 or 3 years, although, as I'll come on in the next slide, it's a very unstable and volatile situation in the sector right now, largely due to what's going on in the US. What you see here is that the largest of the markets is Germany. It's been kind of competing between Germany and Japan for the last 10 years. The EU as a whole is by far, oops, have I just gone and lost that, or is it still there? Okay. The EU is by far the largest collective market. Poland has come up very quickly, largely due to a company called LPP, who have a number of high street brands like I think Reserved, Sinsay, and various others. And what we've seen in the last 5, 6, 7 years, particularly since the US lifted its tariffs back in 2016, I think it was, on bags and footwear, there has been more of a growth in the bag luggage market in Myanmar, but that's now been hit by the tariffs from Trump, which I'll come on to. You're Australians, or at least some of you are. So Australia is there, but it's a pretty small market. Obviously, you have a relatively small population as well, so that's not surprising. So it looks very like all of the other markets in terms of a trend towards an increasing proportion being taken by bags rather than apparel per se. And around 20 million of exports last year in 2024. In 2025, we haven't sort of obviously got the whole of 2025's figures, but what we were seeing in the first half of the year, and this was picked up in a World Bank report that came out in June, was a slight uptick compared to that trend downwards in 23, 24. And this could have been down to a number of reasons. One of them would have been the return of a number of companies which had exited in 21, 22, 23, who were just seeing Myanmar as too cheap to not be looking at, but also where they were looking at some of the risks in other markets, particularly Bangladesh, which is probably the main competitor for Myanmar. Myanmar is a mixture of quite skilled work around things like bags and outerwear, coats, and so on, where it was largely picking up work from China and Vietnam. But there is also sort of more cheap stuff like shirts and so on, where Bangladesh, Cambodia are more of the main competitors. So what we saw in the first half of 25 was a pickup in exports. Whether that continues remains to be seen. And what that led to, amongst other things, was a lot of excessive overtime after Thinjan, as companies were trying to push orders out. And that was also then what played into the workers at that point using their bargaining power to get increased wages in that May-June period, which is always the peak time in Myanmar. So looking broadly at the economic and social impacts of the sector, it's difficult right now to know exactly what the number of jobs is, because the sector is so unstable, but perhaps 500,000 jobs, which are supporting not just the mainly women workers, but also their families. And workers are coming from particularly Ayeyarwady division. In the past, there was a high proportion also from Rakhine, as well as Yangon and Bago, which is where most of the factories are based. It was a sector that was offering one of the key ways into the sort of formalization and social security safety net and so on, albeit a very weak one. And likewise, it was offering a path towards joining trade unions. It was by far the most unionized sector, but as I'll come on in a minute, that was still at a very low rate. And then within the sector, most of the factories had been built in the last 10 years. So that was an opportunity for using the latest models in terms of renewable energy and boilers and so on. And that's an area where the EU's Made in Myanmar programme has been working in addition to social compliance. And then there's a broader economic effect of the sector, which I'll come in the next slide to, relating to foreign exchange. But also, I think the very fact that these exports are contributing to Myanmar's trade, and therefore reducing the trade deficit, helps then to get Min Aung Hlaing, who's rather fixated about his trade deficit, to be more relaxed about allowing imports. So imports being things like fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, etc. So it has a very important part of, it is a very important part of Myanmar's economy for a variety of reasons. In terms of the foreign exchange, I wanted to go through this in a bit of detail because there's a lot of confusion, understandably, about foreign exchange, both generally in Myanmar, but also related to the sector, not least because there are so many different exchange rates that are currently used by the central bank and by the open market. So as of October 2024, all companies in the cut-make sector who were bringing in dollars have to change now 100% of them at what's called the online trading rate, which today is 3625 chats to the dollar. It went up by 1 chat yesterday compared to today. Now that's 18% less than the current market rate. The market rate's been quite stable over the last 6 months, although I think that's largely a reflection of a declining dollar value globally. So what that means is effectively, if you're bringing in money to pay workers' salaries, which is the main thing that companies are bringing in foreign exchange for, and the companies I'm talking about here are not the brands, it's the factory owners or others in that part of the value chain, usually companies who are based in Hong Kong, Shenzhen, perhaps Singapore. So they're bringing in chat, they're exchanging it at 3625 as of today. They're losing about 18% of that value compared to if they changed it on the market rate. So how much money is that overall? Well, currently, as you'll have seen from the first slide I showed you, the overall export value of the sector is around 4 billion. And MGMA informally estimates that about 10% of that 4 billion actually enters Myanmar as money, as foreign exchange. And that's a reflection of the cut-make-pack sector, that you only bring in the money to pay for wages, things like the raw materials, so the fabric and so on come in as fabric, not as money, because Myanmar is in the CMP mode, so therefore by and large it's only the labor of the workers putting the garments and the bags together, which is the added value coming from Myanmar. So if you take 10% of 4 billion, you get 400 million. And if you work out what 18% of that is, in other words, the kind of lost value, what that means is that the central bank is effectively getting a 70 million discount per year for foreign exchange, which might sound like a lot to you and me, but isn't actually particularly significant. What do they then use the foreign exchange overall that they're getting? How do they use that? So firstly, they use it for exchange rate policy, and we've seen a fairly stable exchange rate over the last year. Then they use it as an allocation to the ministries, and that includes, of course, the Ministry of Defence, Tatmadaw, for when those ministries want to buy something, and there's a very complex permission and rationing where a ministry will have to apply for foreign exchange. They will get that at 2,100, which is the central bank's reference rate, but that's a somewhat fictitious figure and simply reflects also the way it's on their government budgets. I'm probably completely confusing you all by now, but apologies, stick with me. And then the final thing that is used for is selling it back to private sector imports, who are largely only getting it for priority imports. So thank you, Peter Bossing, for priority imports for fuel, edible oil, pharmaceuticals, some raw materials. And the central bank's been more transparent about this over the last year or so. So if you go on the website, you'll see a daily report that they do saying how much of each type of currency, so it's not just dollars, it's also yuan, baht, rupees, how much they have sold and at what rate. So this was from last week, which is why it's 3624. As of today, it's 3625. And the Burmese text, I've summarized that there on the side. So you can see that's what they have been allocating it to when the private sector has gone to them saying, we need money to import fuel or edible oil or to pay for our Microsoft Windows Word subscription or whatever. So that's how the foreign exchange is being used for the country, as indeed, of course, all other foreign exchange which enters the reserves. But I've put some time into that because sometimes I see claims that the 4 billion is all going into the Tatmadaws pocket. It's not like that at all. It's a much smaller percentage that even comes into the country, and that is going into the foreign exchange reserves to be allocated in different ways. The US trade tariffs, what's the impact? I think very unpredictable. The US is not the most significant market for Myanmar by a long way. I think it was about 5th or 6th in that chart I showed you. And that's largely because it was quite late to come back on, because up until 2016, there were still tariffs, whereas the EU was giving tariff-free preference. So brands were tending to place their sourcing depending on where they could get a better deal if they were importing into the US. Where I think will have the biggest impact is at the global macro level, because I think everything that Trump is doing is contributing to an economic slowdown, which means people buy less less footwear and apparel and bags. We saw that temporary impact where people were rushing to get stuff out of the door before the tariffs kicked in. And then we saw the initial listing of Myanmar as having a 45% tariff, and then that came down to 40 when the final list came out. And that puts Myanmar there with Laos as being twice as much as most of its neighbours and competitors. We saw this morning that, or at least I saw this morning, that Twinkle Myanmar, which is a bags factory in Myanmar, is Chinese owned, has closed down. And has apparently, I'm glad to see, paid its workers what they're due in terms of redundancy. And so I think that's going to be quite typical, that there will be certain factories which had set themselves up particularly to produce for the US luggage market, who will be badly hit by this. Back in the first half of the year, people were saying, well, maybe Myanmar will escape because, it's all going to be about China. And so production out of China will move to elsewhere, both to Vietnam, to Myanmar. There might be knock-on effect that stuff from Myanmar stuff from Vietnam will be moved on to be produced in Myanmar. I think that's unlikely with a 40% tariff. Obviously, places like Bangladesh are going to be a more attractive option on economic grounds, even if politically there's still the instability. And indeed, I was reading an article the other day about Bangladesh feeling more hopeful about its sector. There's also, although nobody's talked about it, the fact that if Trump is threatening India with secondary tariffs for buying Russian oil, to be consistent, not that Trump is consistent, he would need to also do the same to Myanmar, which is buying Russian oil. So unpredictable, but obviously not a good thing as it currently stands for the market, and particularly for certain factories, and therefore for the workers who are employed in them. Moving on to heightened human rights due diligence. So this is the idea that you don't just do normal human rights due diligence that you should do anywhere as a company. When you have a conflict-affected country, you need to be looking from the perspective of how that conflict is affecting the business and how the business is affecting the conflict. And so this is a number of the different issues that over the last 5 years we have identified as ways in which the conflict and the business could interact. And they are still very much, I think, live and real. And in particular, when one looks at, for example, a recent report that came out from MICS trade union, which is one of the remaining trade unions that operates in the country, a lot of the concerns there were about military personnel becoming involved in disputes within the factories or being present within the area, and the threat that provides for workers. On the right-hand side of the slide, the most important issue is the fact that overall the conflict, the disruption, and the fact that the minimum wage has now not been increased for over 6 years, combined with very significant inflation, means that wages are extremely low. But then beyond that, there has also been the impact, which I'll come on to, on labour rights defenders and trade union organising, and the ability, therefore, of workers to raise different issues, whether it be about wages or about military presence or about other safety issues. So this is the sort of advice that we give brands, particularly if they are not necessarily present in Myanmar. Obviously, the ones who have bigger teams and who have a presence in Myanmar understand this because they're living it each day. But many garment companies are very much sourcing at arm's length and may not even visit the market and may only rely on social impact auditors and others. And Ma Chui is going to come on to that in a bit. Just to highlight the wages question, these figures are slightly old in that they reflect reports that were done before the recent wage increases that took place in May, June. So on the right-hand side, you've got extracts from a UN report that came out in February, which was reflecting data from 2024. And in that report, you can see the average monthly take-home pay. And so that's a take-home pay that's not the basic pay that everybody gets. You have to also turn up every day for work for that and do overtime and so on, was 353,000 kyat. It will be more than that now because of the increases, but it is also very seasonal because it depends on overtime and demand. If you want to know what a living wage looks like, the Wage Indicator Foundation produced figures globally, including for Myanmar. And this is the latest one that they did from April. So their view of a living wage is what you should get before you do overtime and get bonuses. So you can see there that their estimate from April was 825,245 kyat. So that's over twice as much as what people were getting even after overtime. So there's a very, very big gap between a living wage and what workers are currently getting, which is what, of course, is contributing to both the dissatisfaction and the strikes on the ground, but also the fact that most workers are looking to see whether they could go and work either in other sectors or more likely to try and work elsewhere in the region. This is a extract from a recent report by the MICS trade union, whose leader, Thet Net Aung, is still detained, and highlights sort of the key grievances which were coming up. So forced overtime and the targets being unreasonable, occupational safety and health, wages, and termination and compensation in that order. They have a hotline that's been going now for a couple of years. So this is a reflection of the cases that come to that, but it's a fairly broad reflection of the issues that we see across the sector, whether or not the workers are members of unions. On the right-hand side of this slide, just reminding you, the ILO, when it did its commission of inquiry, was looking at two conventions, the one on freedom of association and the one on forced labour. And although they were broadly looking at it from the perspective of what the military government was doing, they also did have some sections related to those issues within the private sector, which you can read in their report. So they quite rightly identified cases of union busting where the private sector were very much active in that. And also, as I've mentioned before, the questions of forced overtime where, for example, a worker who refuses to do overtime could lose their job. So that can be counted as forced labour. There was a report done just before the coup on the state of the union trade union sector in Myanmar, done by Gavin Blau. So this is taking data from that. So you had at that time 3 registered federations. You had other registered trade unions, including at the factory level, but then you had a group of labour rights defenders who either identified themselves as unions which didn't have registration, or as NGOs, as labour rights, human rights defenders. So there was a wide variety of groups, fairly low membership, almost entirely in the garment sector itself, estimated at 3 to 4% back in 2020, definitely lower now for a number of reasons. And I've highlighted here in yellow the ABFTU and the Solidarity Trade Union of Myanmar, because although both are still continuing to operate, both of them in recent weeks have had arrests of their leadership, and I'll come back to that. So since the coup, it has become much more difficult for unions to operate, but they are still legal. Likewise, it's become much more difficult for human rights, labour rights defenders, NGOs to operate both in legal terms due to the new associations law, but also just in practical terms. So to give one example, which sadly was confirmed today, Theta Sway, who is a labour rights defender from the ABFTU, and she was arrested in Tachilek Airport in April 2025, coming back into the country. She's just been sentenced to 3 years under 505A for allegedly demonstrating back in the first week after the coup. So this is really quite both ridiculous, both from a personal perspective, but also she was working extremely hard for the workers. I've now managed to lose my screen by clicking on it, I think, to get rid of your messages. Now you can still see my screen, can't you, all of you? I just need to make it bigger somehow. Can you still see it? I'm just going to stop sharing and reshare it because I've managed to mess it up. So talk amongst yourselves. Okay, good. So the other much more reported case compared to the ABFTU is the Solidarity Trade Union of Myanmar, led by Kyaw Phyo Phyo Aye, who together with 10 other members were arrested last month. They were very active in supporting strikers and workers in particularly Shui Pyi industrial zone, and they've been charged with the Habitual Offenders Act, which is quite unusual in its use. I haven't seen its use since the coup. It's the first time. As I've mentioned, trade union organisation has gone down, not least because of high labour turnover, but also because there is a sense amongst workers that joining a union is a political act, and so they're afraid to do it, and they just want to keep their heads down. Occasionally, we have managed to intervene through different ways, largely through some of the embassies who are actively involved in this, to get labour rights defenders and trade unionists out, as happened with Action Labour Rights members who were arrested 2 years ago. But unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be currently viable for the people who've recently been arrested. I recommend to you the latest Frontier Myanmar podcast, which is an interview with Stephen Campbell, who's a good labour expert, who gives a broader overview of what's going on at the moment. I'm not going to go through all of that, but just to say that the ILO have, in their regular reports as part of the Commission inquiry, been in contact with the 3 main unions. So this is the update that they did from about 1.5 years ago, before the ILO governing body, where each of the unions sort of listed what they were and were not able to do. And in particular, you have the MICS trade unions, Thetne Aung's group, who have been actively involved in dialogue with brands and in setting up the grievance mechanism that I spoke to. The ILO resolution in June called on all of the ILO's members, so that includes employer members, to support the creation of a climate promoting freedom of association and eliminating forced labour, and to work towards that, including through monitoring and reporting. So that's something which is not just about what the Myanmar regime needs to do, but it's also what those brands who source and the companies, the facilities that provide for them, should be doing as well. And the Australian government joined with a number of other governments in making a statement in support of the resolution, but highlighting the fact that all the members should not take measures that would hurt workers. And that's the big real challenge of how one balances that, because simply arguing, as certain groups have done, that everyone should leave is not actually going to help workers. And this, as I've mentioned earlier, is a major contributor to household incomes. That's why the EU's Made in Myanmar programme has continued, working on both social and environmental compliance, including freedom of association, including wages, and it acts as eyes and ears on the ground for some of the smaller brands, mainly from Europe, who don't have a presence. So it's regularly talking and training the factories that those companies source from, and working with some of the larger brands such as Bestseller, and some of the other members, Adidas, to address both collectively and individually some of the issues in their factories relating particularly to labour rights. If you're looking for more information, both the Made in Myanmar website has got a lot on what they're doing, including the 30 members. Eurocham is active with some of the same companies and is in the process of updating its fact sheet on the sector. I also recommend Open Supply Hub as a means to map who's sourcing, although that depends very much on the brands themselves disclosing their facilities, and large companies like Inditex do not. And then you have a very good source in Myanmar Labour News, who have both a website and Facebook page, and I thoroughly encourage you to support them. And then individual companies, by far the best of these is Bestseller, who do a very detailed 6-monthly report on how they are seeking to source sustainably and responsibly. And I think that is my last slide.